Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, Alex Bozich and I are joined by Rick Bozich from WDRB in Louisville. The three of us were texting during the IU Purdue game. We were texting after it, and so we decided to just bring that text conversation here to the air because we're all a little exasperated with the losing, with the offensive woes, and just kind of trying to figure out what's going on with this Indiana basketball season. So we talk about that and more on this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink. And this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink is brought to you by our friends at Home Field. And at homefieldapparel.com, you will find the comfiest and the most unique licensed IU apparel that is available anywhere. Home Field was started by an IU grad, and all of their apparel is designed and printed out of Indianapolis. And now that we are well into 2019 and the winter, turn back the clock with Home Field's 1910 IU Crest sweatshirt. It features an IU Crest from 1910 on a tri-blend fleece crew neck that is so comfortable. And if hoodies are kind of more your style than, non-hoodie sweatshirts, I definitely recommend the tri-blend fleece hoodie that they have there with the IU Bison logo. Another, kind of old, not so well-known logo. I get so many questions about it, and it's cool, kind of being able to talk about it, and even a lot of IU fans don't know that we had that logo, that mascot, for a little while. So always an interesting conversation starter. That would be another option there as well. And when you go there, don't forget to use the promo code BRINK at checkout. When you do that, you will get 15% off your first order. That is homefieldapparel.com. Promo code BRINK. Home Field, wear one for the team. All right, here now is our conversation with Rick Bozich. Okay. Well, Rick Bozich is here. Alex Bozich is here. Guys, let's talk a little IU basketball as we try to make sense of another loss to Purdue and just another loss in general. 11 and 12 games now, and really just reaching a new low of offensive ineptitude in last night's game. Rick, we'll just start with you. I mean, just kind of your general thoughts coming out of that game last night against Purdue.
Wow. One thing I thought was just strange was how many three-pointers they took. I think 25 of the 55 field goal attempts were three-pointers, and for a team that's not a good three-point shooting team, I kind of wondered what was going on. And I know that a lot of people had mentioned that you had to make threes to beat Purdue, but it just seemed like, especially late, there were some threes that I'm not sure that's what I would have gone with. But it's the same story we've seen with this team, really, I think, all year, is they get very few easy baskets, and that's hard. When you're coming down and always running your offense against the set defense, and you don't have very many good shooters, and you're not breaking people down and getting drive and dish good looks or layups, you're going to struggle. And they've struggled. I mean, 46 points, that's the second time they've hit that number this year, and that's hard to believe.
Yeah, and the thing there is Purdue takes more threes than anybody in the conference. They also give up more three-pointers than anybody in the conference. And that's kind of been a trend with Indiana offensively, is really playing into what the other teams want us to do. And, I think we all felt that last night Indiana had some opportunities to go inside, maybe get Juwan Morgan working inside more. He ends up taking 7 3-pointers. And that's kind of become a bit of a theme for this team where, they just seem at times offensively to not have a great understanding of what they're trying to do and not a great level of chemistry when they are actually trying to do it. And that ends up just kind of playing into the defense's hands, because when you do that, you just end up kind of taking what's there. And, once again, Indiana did that because clearly Purdue was very happy to just let Indiana stand out there and shoot three-pointers.
Yeah, they're not dictating much. Another thing I've said, and Alex and I talked about earlier today, is this team, it's been a trend all year in a number of these games where they're kind of dogfights and they fall behind, that they either get right to the point where they, tie the score or can't quite get there. And then in a few games when they actually have gotten in charge, they can maybe get it to 4, but they can never get it to 7 or 9, where it's like a 3-possession lead where they're really putting game pressure on the other team. They never can. They're not good enough to extend the lead where you're making the other team to play with some pressure. And I think we saw that last night. They got it to 4, but they couldn't get it beyond 4, and that's not working.
Yeah, Alex, you wrote about the game obviously in your 5 takeaways. What were your overall thoughts, especially about the offense?
I mean, the offense has been basically the same story for most of the conference season, in that there's just a lot of guys standing around. There were several possessions last night where it got almost like to the end of the shot clock, and you had one guy trying to post up, Devontae Green with the ball, and then 3 guys on the other side not really moving, and Devontae had to throw up a kind of a crazy contested or just a terrible shot. And we know how that story is going to end because we've seen it play out so many times. And so, I think the frustrating thing about last night's game for those who watched it or for those who were there was you hold Carson Edwards, who is one of the most dynamic scorers, best players in the Big Ten, if not the country, to 4 of 24 from the field. He scores 9 points. You hold Purdue, the best offensive team in the Big Ten, coming in to 48 points, and you still can't muster enough offense to kind of support a win. And it's the scores have 2 different games in the season where you only score 46 points, to have the second worst offense in the Big Ten with Romeo Langford on your roster, and to really kind of regress as the season has moved along, I think raises some serious questions just about what the game plan is offensively, and how does it get fixed moving forward. I think we can all agree that this season is, in terms of anything postseason or meeting expectations, is just not going to materialize into what people had hoped. But the thing to me is, how does it get better from here? And I think that's obviously what we'll talk probably a lot about in the off season and going into next year. But I just don't see right now a lot of reasons for optimism with the offense and kind of what they're doing on a game-to-game basis that suggests that that's going to get better anytime soon.
Well, no, it certainly doesn't look like it will this season. But you bring up an interesting point looking forward. If you look at what Archie did at Dayton, he had 5 offenses that were in the top 75 nationally. 4 of them were top 53. The one offense at Dayton that wasn't good, the 2016 team, coincided with the one team that wasn't a very good three-point shooting team. And what we've seen here at Indiana these first 2 seasons is offenses that haven't been very good, and the shooting's been even worse than that one team at Dayton. So, Rick, I think we all agree that even given the injuries, the shooting woes, all the explanations you want to give for the offense, it should be better at this point than it is. I think we all agree on that. But as we look at reasons for hope, I mean, is it as simple as, you've got to clean up, fix some deficiencies in the roster, get some shooting in here, and that's going to fix a lot? Because, Archie has shown that he can coach a good, competent offense. Not at the Big Ten level, but, in a good conference. I have a hard time feeling like he's just clueless and forgotten how to do that. So, is that something that you look to and say, once they clean up some of those things, then we can really judge it? Or is there something that you're seeing with the inability to get this team to even play competently on offense that is really concerning you about, his leadership moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's one thing. It's a bunch of things. I would start out with this. They need to get a couple of guys who really can break you down off the dribble and attack. And maybe Rob Finney will become that guy. Early in the year, he looked like he could become that guy. He hasn't really been that in Big Ten play, but he's going to have to be because he's their number one option at point guard. And they got to get better at small forward. And I don't know if that'll be Jerome Hunter. We don't know if he'll be able to play again, but all the discussion was about what a good offensive player he was, what a good shooter he was, because you got to be able to attack from those 2 positions. If you look at what they have this year, they've got below average point guard play in terms of guys who can get in the lane and score for themselves or drive and dish to other people. They've got Langford, who is dealing with a clogged lane and has had some shooting issues. At small forward, I guess you say Durham. He's not a shooter either. He's improved his 3-point shot, but he's not really a feared offensive player. Justin Smith, his skills with the ball are below average. He's not a good shooter, and he's got almost a 3-to-1 turnover to assist ratio. And you're playing for a lot of the year with an undersized center in Juwan Morgan. And once they got into Big Ten play, there's some guys who are as big, if not bigger than him, and certainly broader. And we've watched Juwan Morgan struggle to score in the paint because he's getting bodied up and he's having to, twist and turn just to get, bank shots up over these guys. And so that's a 5-position problem. I guess for next year, you'd say if Jerod Davis can get healthy and get in shape, he can give them at least average Big Ten center play. You bring Jerome Hunter in, maybe you get something from Race Thompson. You hope that, Finney improves his confidence, strength, athleticism. And then, I don't know who they plug in at the off guard spot, whether it's Al Durham or Armand Franklin or a grad transfer or whatever, but that's what it's going to have to be. I mean, the scheme is one thing that in many ways this year that they're just not good enough. I've talked to a couple NBA scouts today, and one of them said to me, I asked him about Romeo, whether he'd taken a hit. And he said, no, Romeo hasn't taken a hit. Look who he's playing with. He's playing with one guy who's going to be in the G League, and the rest of those guys would be backup players on good Big Ten teams. And that was his view. And this is a guy with no connection to IU. He's an NBA scout who sees a lot of games.
Alex, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest, and I'm sure we're going to get into this. I would say moving forward, the biggest reason for optimism, obviously Archie's got a good track record at Dayton. I think overall he's done a good job throughout his career of being a good defensive coach. You cite some of the offensive numbers. I think a lot of it does have to do with the lack of shooting on this roster. But also, I think there's something deeper with this team that I think we've all been kind of searched for answers. And I've talked to a lot of different people, and everyone has a different theory or a different thing that they like to bring up, or it's this person's fault, or it's this thing, or it's that thing. I think at the end of the day, you have to look at this roster and you say, this isn't working. It's not going to work. And for next season, the hope, I guess, has to be you get a different mix of players in. You have another offseason to kind of, as mentioned, Finney and Durham get, maybe make an offseason leap. You get Jerome Hunter in, you get Jerod Davis healthy, you get Trace Jackson Davis. The vibe of the team is going to be different, and you have to hope that there's just some. If it takes some attrition in terms of certain guys leaving, if there was a bad mixture somewhere on this roster, that's up for the coaching staff and the players to decide who wants to actually be there and kind of get this thing going in the right direction. That's really what the coaching staff's going to be paid. They're going to have to earn their paycheck in the off season, because you can't afford to have another situation like this where you have a pretty good amount of talent and you just kind of squander it all away. So I think the reason for optimism going into next year is Archie overall has a pretty good track record in terms of what he's been able to do with teams, and obviously build a really good program at Dayton. And then maybe it's just a different mix of players gels together differently, and maybe the high level talent on the roster isn't as good, but maybe it's just the pieces fit together better, and you can have more success. But that's one of the things I've talked to a lot of people about is I think they're going to have a hard time selling just optimism going into next season after how things have turned out this year. You worry about just kind of the fan support and how many people are going to want to stick with it, because this season is, losing 11 out of 12. That's just hard to swallow for a lot of people.
Lots of highlight videos of the Michigan State game.
And the Marquette game.
Yeah, that'll be it. So, Alex, you hit on something interesting there, which I think is the next direction that we should take the conversation in, because I think it's the other thing that's really plagued this team. In addition to the shooting and the offensive woes, it has just felt for a long time, really ever since the calendar turned, like there's just something wrong with this team, from a chemistry issue, from a togetherness issue. And, coming into the season, we thought, hey, the end of February, we're going to be hitting our stride. We're going to be talking about what the seeding is. And instead, we're talking about just giving effort and knowing how to communicate with each other. And our context coming into the Purdue game is, let's see if these guys can play hard. And Archie, when he was asked what the drastic changes were, talked about, guys having a meeting, getting on the same page and, getting better at communicating together. I mean, if you're trying to figure that stuff out in February, you've got issues. And I think, something that might have actually kind of spilled over into the public or onto the broadcast last night was, certain players and how they reacted when taken out of the game or how they reacted on the bench, not looking to be very receptive of coaching, not looking to be very interested in what was going on the court. And, so I guess, Rick, I wonder, and we've seen some playing time change. Some guys are playing less now. Other guys are playing more. How much do you think that has factored in to the issue that this team has had? And are you at all concerned, at least just based on what you know, about the way that Archie has handled some of those things? Has he tolerated too much and not put down, a firmer boundary on what's going to be acceptable, what's not going to be acceptable with his program?
I think several things is I saw early in the year, Duke game was one, maybe even one before, where there was guys, and I don't get in the habit of like calling out individual players because they're college players, not giving effort to get back on defense. I mean, you didn't have to look very hard to see it if you were watching it, that guys would either get knocked down on an offensive play and didn't get a call and were real slow to get up and come back down, or they turn the ball over or not give chase to like, I'm not going to let this guy get a layup or dunk on me, and they kind of jog back. And I think that started in November. I really do. And I was surprised that it wasn't corrected back then, where I think that guys didn't seem to be as competitive as you would think they would be. And that's just what I saw. Maybe you see more of that stuff when a team's losing. And the other thing is when you look at it, if this is a team that beat Marquette, it's a team that went on the road and should have beat Arkansas, but lost in overtime. They beat Butler. They beat Louisville. They won the first 3 Big Ten games, and then they've fallen off a cliff. And so you say, is it like, are the players really that far less talented than the opponents? Is the coaching bad, or is it an internal issue where these guys just don't get along or don't like the coach or don't respond to the coaching or don't respond to each other? And because you get so little access to these guys, you get no locker room access. All you get is post-game press conference access. People are just guessing or reading message boards or hearing what you see on Twitter, Instagram, or whatever. And there's occasional hints of stuff like that, but I don't think we're ever going to really know, or we probably won't know until the end of the season when we see if there's any kind of extra attrition. But it's got to be one of those 3 things. And I think because of the way they played early in the year, people are less likely to believe it's a lack of talent. If they had just, if they lost like 6 of these 12 games or 8 of these 12 games, but to lose 11 of these 12 games, which, as we've talked about it, when you look at the history of IU basketball, taking out those first 3 Tom Crean years, hadn't been done since 1944. Something's got to be there.
And to a certain extent, you expect some of that, I think, when you have a coaching change, and you have guys who were recruited by one regime that weren't recruited by this coach. And, a lot has been talked about, the 3 Crean recruits asked for their release. Archie, re-recruited them back. Then, there's been talk about how the APR might have impacted who he could keep, who he couldn't, all of that stuff. So you might expect some of that personality conflict, whether it's among players, whether it's among coaches. How much do you, quote, give a coach a pass for that? Or do you, now that he's in his second year and he's had all of these guys, do you, again, and you talked about some of those issues that we saw earlier in the season, how much of an impact do you think that would have made if that firmer boundary had been laid? And how much do you think it might have been impacted by, injuries shortening the bench? And maybe, a new coach with guys he didn't recruit trying to be patient and reach them in kind of a new era, maybe where you don't necessarily see coaches calling out players or just throwing everybody on the bench right away.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. The injuries are a factor that at this point in the season where more guys are back healthy, we do have to remember that early in the year, he didn't really have the latitude to bench some of these guys because the bench was pretty thin. So that might have contributed to it. But I guess what I would say in contrast is watching this year at what Chris Mack has done at the University of Louisville is here's a first-year coach who's come in here, and his best returning player is a former McDonald's All-American named VJ King, and he's parked him on the bench, and he doesn't hardly leave the bench anymore. I mean, he didn't play a minute against Duke. He played like less than 3 minutes against Clemson in their last game. And it's like, here's the deal. The guys that are going to play on defense and value the ball the way that I want you to are going to play. And if you're not going to do it, you're going to sit. And Darius Perry is a guy that I think a lot of people thought at Louisville was going to be the starting point guard. And he did some crazy stuff early in the year, and he transitioned to Christian Cunningham as the leader of the team. And that's just the way it is. And that's on the coaching staff. I think you got to figure out pretty early in the season, like who's buying into what I'm doing and who's going to be serious about it. And if you're not bought in, then it's time to the next man. And I think that's one thing that this year is when you've watched some of the mistakes we've seen in terms of guys not getting back on defense, guys not concentrating in terms of their defensive commitments are in the pack line defense, that you wonder if the buy-in level is where it needs to be.
Yeah, I agree. And the other thing I'll say is in terms of, I think it's, it's obviously fair game to criticize, not individual players by name, but, the coaching staff, can't be completely absolved of blame just for, I think in some ways, how this roster looks overall. Now, the injuries do play a part of it, but as you mentioned, what Mac did at Louisville, going out and getting 2 grad transfers now that I think he's starting both. And I think a lot of people were intrigued by the idea of bringing in a guy like Evan Fitzner when we kind of look at the shooting numbers, but we're now late in the season and he's not even getting off the bench. And I think some of the playing time that he got early in the year maybe came at the expense of some of the younger guys that maybe could have used those minutes. And I think overall it was just, it's the hands were tied a little bit in terms of who they could bring in. Obviously it was a great deal to get Romeo and Rob Finney, but you have to question some of, the addition now in hindsight of Fitzner, and maybe if there was anyone else out there that could have helped this team a little bit more. So, I think that's the one thing next year that kind of, as we kind of move away from the Tom Crean era, and it becomes Archie's roster and basically all his players, there'll still be obviously some holdovers potentially from Crean, but I'll be interested to see kind of if getting quote unquote his guys in here completely kind of to more success. Because the other thing I'll say is you just kind of look at some of the guys who came back from last season to this year, and other than Juwan Morgan and Al Durham, I just don't see a lot of guys that really improved or developed much from last season. Maybe Deron Davis to an extent. Obviously he got hurt. He's been helpful late in the season, but beyond that, I mean, I don't necessarily think that Justin Smith or Devontae Green at this point have really progressed in any meaningful way in their the second season under Archie.
Rick, when do you think it is fair to start rendering full judgments on a coach? I mean, you lose 12 out of 13, you get all kinds of hot takes. There have been people, saying this is like Billy Gillispie and Indiana needs to cut bait after 2 years and all this stuff. And I think, to me, as much criticism as I think the staff has deserved, and, we've talked about it on this show and on the assembly call, and to the extent that I think they're getting it, I still think more reasonable minds look at this as you can't really fully judge this until, year 3, until year 4. Let him get his guys in there. Let's see what kind of program he actually wants to build. And yet you go through a stretch like this, and it's pretty bad, obviously. So when do you think it's fair to start rendering some kind of final judgment on, hey, is this the right guy to be leading this program?
Yeah, I have all kind of thoughts on that. I mean, just logically speaking, I think any coach deserves 4 years. I mean, and possibly 5. And I know that we don't live in that kind of era anymore, but you deserve at least 4 years. And that's how it should be. That's how it usually is in most places. And the hot takes are out there, and you just have to tune them out and move on and, give a coach a chance to breathe. And I'll say that, I mean, the Billy Gillispie comparisons are ridiculous because the main thing one of the reasons Billy Gillispie got dismissed at Kentucky is just some of the things he was doing to players, and the players rebelled in the locker room and different things. And there was, losing games was one thing, but that's in his off the court behavior and different things like that. And we're not hearing any of this kind of stuff about Archie Miller and his staff, and nor do I expect to. But the caveat I say to that is, I mean, they've lost 11 out of 12. They're at Iowa. Then they come home and play Wisconsin and Michigan State. Then they go to Illinois, which is a huge contrast to Indiana because they struggled early, and now they really are looking as like the most improved team in the Big Ten. And then they came home and play a Rutgers team, which already beat them. Let's say if they lose all those games and go out in the Big Ten tournament in the first game, and that would be, 6 more games, and they finish the season with 17 losses in 18 games, that's a pretty big – I can't remember that ever happening really anywhere, except for some recent, like Pittsburgh with Stallings or some of those things. And at Indiana, I just wonder how that would go down. And you wonder, how do you sell optimism for next season? How do you sell optimism in recruiting? That's a topic that they'll have to have serious discussion on because, I mean, they need to win a couple of these games before the end of the year to stop the drumbeat of negativity now, which we all know is getting louder and louder. And it's not just negativity, it's skepticism about, what's going on. And that's kind of, once it gets in the bloodstream, it's kind of hard to get that stuff out.
Yeah, it is, boy. And it's, it's hard to know what team to expect to show up too from game to game. And obviously, they really pulled together for this Purdue game just in terms of the effort, in a big contrast to Minnesota. But that's what makes it so hard to project forward, because you look at each one of those games that you just said, it's pretty easy to see a scenario where they would lose each one of those games. It's become harder and harder to see the scenario where they would win them. I mean, what?
And you throw in the Nebraska game was just brutal.
Ugh.
The Michigan game, where did they fall behind? The 17-0, or what was? I don't even remember. Was it 17-0 and then 23-4 or something? And it's just so many dramatic moments in there that people look at and scratch their head and say, what's really going on here? And to me, the 2 games to me that really tilted it was when they had that stretch. They come back from beating Michigan State. They got 2 home games against Iowa and Ohio State. Had to win one of those 2. I mean, those teams are not the elite teams in the Big Ten. They're in that middle pack where most people thought Indiana was going to be this season, and they failed to beat either one of them in Assembly Hall. To me, that was a moment where this moved into like, this is a little bit more than we thought it was.
Switching subjects a little bit, Romeo Langford. Mm-hmm. What have you thought generally about his play and about how he has handled this losing streak and some of the personal struggles that he's had on the court during it?
I'll say this, I was very impressed by him against Purdue. I mean, this guy was vomiting. This is a guy that got busted in the mouth and sat there and made 2 free throws with blood there on his lips. We saw that. I know people were quick to criticize him because he didn't take any shots in the second half, but when I was watching the game unfold, he didn't look like a guy who wasn't engaged on offense. He did draw some fouls and shoot some free throws. I mean, he did, it was just a quirk that I guess he didn't take any field goal attempts. I think he's handled it pretty well because none of us and none of the people criticizing him can really grasp the expectations that were placed on this guy coming in to sort of be this, the next Eric Gordon, the next Cody Zeller, the next savior of IU basketball. And he's handled all that stuff pretty well. I mean, could he shoot better? Sure. But a lot of freshmen don't shoot a high percentage. I'd say other than, some of the elite guys like Williamson and Barrett and maybe Reddish, he's played as well as any freshman, that I can think of. I was talking to an NBA scout today. Quentin Grimes was rated right there with Romeo before the season, and he's become a non-factor at Kansas. You can't say that Romeo's become a non-factor. He's their primary offensive weapon. So he's become a convenient guy for people to criticize, I think, because IU's been losing. But I think for the most part, his play has been pretty much what I thought it would be.
We need more step-back three-pointers like we saw at the end of the first half. That was beautiful.
That was a big shot. He knows he's definitely improved his free throw shooting. I mean, he was 9 for 10 from the line against Purdue.
Yeah.
And early in the year, he had games where he was missing 3, 4, 5 free throws in the game. So I've seen improvement in it. Does he have to get stronger? Yeah. Does he have to become a better ball handler? Yeah. Does he have to play through contact? Yeah. But, he's a first-year player who's moving from playing high school basketball in Southern Indiana. It's not like he played in Indy or Chicago against dudes who, are the kind of guys that he's playing against in the Big Ten, and he's handled it pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, any freshman that's averaging over 17 a game, and that's his overall stats. I haven't looked at just his Big Ten numbers, but I agree that he's been kind of a convenient target for people who want to say, well, Indiana's losing games. They got this guy that are supposed to be good. They were ranked 21st at one point. Reality is, when we talked about this a little bit last week with Jordan Holes, where would Indiana be without Romeo Langford? Think about that. Because there's nobody on this roster really that can create offense besides Juwan Morgan and Romeo Langford. If he wasn't on this team, it could be a lot more ugly than it really is. And I think, people are going to, as time moves on, people are going to, they'll obviously remember this season as one of disappointment and one of expectations that were not met. But they'll also, I feel like, appreciate a kid who could have gone anywhere coming to IU, and from what I've seen, he hasn't, he's represented himself and his family and as well as you could, and he's played hard. That's the other thing. The misconception about Romeo is the way he glides around out there. Sometimes he gets criticized for maybe not caring enough or just kind of being too nonchalant. A guy that's puking in the trash can at halftime and getting knocked down 3 or 4 times as hard as he did last night and bleeding from his mouth, and he's still going after it. That's the kind of player that Indiana basketball needs more of right now. If all of those guys last night, and they did play hard, but just think if they had that mentality for the whole season where this team could have gone. And, I think overall Romeo's going to go on to have a really successful career beyond Indiana. And I think, like I said, as time moves on, Indiana fans are going to really, I think, embrace, just him as a player, but more importantly, as a person and as someone who has represented himself with class all the way.
Yeah, I mean, you can have a stoic outward disposition and still be an intense competitor. We've seen that time and time again, and I think for the most part, Romeo has shown that. I've had, several people try to argue that part of the problem with this team's, intensity or up and down emotional state, is because they're following, the lead of Romeo because he sets the tone. And my response is always, look, if you're looking to a freshman to be the emotional leader of your team, you're probably in a bad place. But it does maybe go to, a bit of a point that, because I agree with everything that you said, Alex, and look, Romeo came along as a recruit when he came along as a recruit, and Archie did a great job of getting him. Hindsight's 20/20, but this program may not have been ready. The culture not built, the internal leadership not there, the experience not there to really be able to capitalize or maximize, on what Romeo can bring. Because if it's a team that is, following his lead, I guess in that way, that's just not going to be a team that's set up for success. So I think that my point being, I think that's an unfair criticism of him. And I think for the most part, he's competed just fine and competed very hard, especially given how the season has, kind of fallen down here.
Yeah, I think that's so much of a false narrative. I think the way they want to fit them, when a guy plays under control and a team is winning, then he's poised, he's cool, and he's so efficient. He never gets rattled. When he does that and the team's losing, then he's emotionless. He doesn't have any passion. And the flip side is, and I think you mentioned it once about, when Indiana was winning and Thomas Bryant was so emotional, he's the emotional leader and he's getting everybody going. But when they lose games, he's out of control. He can't control his emotions. So I don't really think making judgments over the way guys act on the court is really very precise.
Yeah. So as we go down the stretch now, obviously, as you mentioned earlier, Rick, we're just looking for a win. just get a win. And I think it's important. I mean, you're right. If you just, lose out here, I mean, that, really makes a difficult situation even more difficult. But aside from that, what are you watching for? Because I had a lot of, saw some people in the chat, last night, the season's over. And yeah, maybe, fulfilling the potential that this team had, that possibility is over. But there's still games, and they're still important, and there's still young players that we're counting on to be building blocks of the program that are going to be playing. And that makes these games really important. What are you watching for down the stretch to try to get something meaningful out of these, final 5 regular season games and then whatever's left in the tournament?
First thing I'll watch for is consistency of effort and enthusiasm, whether the players are still engaged and feel like, winning games is important to them, because the general takeaway from the Minnesota game was that it wasn't. It was pretty much across the board. People felt like, and even I have a friend who lives in Minneapolis who mainly covers Minnesota, who called me and said, these guys look like they didn't want to be here. They quit. It wasn't just an IU person. It was a Minnesota person. Secondly is, I think I'll be looking at who plays, who gets minutes, which if some guys are de-emphasized and some guys are pushed into more prominent roles. And the third thing I'm going to be looking at is, the crowds. They got 3 home games left at Assembly Hall, and see, how much people are still bought into this, and whether there's a significant drop-off in terms of people that show up for the Wisconsin, Michigan State, and Rutgers games.
Alex, what are you going to be watching for?
I mean, a lot of the same things that he mentioned there. I would like to see some of the, if they're, if you're going to not win any games the rest of the way, I think you need to see what you have in Race Thompson and Demezy Anderson or some of these other younger guys. Because if you, Zach McRoberts obviously played last night and was a positive, but that's the thing about Archie. I don't think he's ever going to be a coach that's going to say, we're packing it in. We're not going to play certain guys, but I do think there's some value in getting some of the younger guys some reps and some opportunity just to kind of know if they are going to be coming back next year, then you want to at least have them get some experience in a meaningful, quote unquote meaningful Big Ten game, just to kind of give them that opportunity. But I look for the same thing. I think at any point the rest of the year, the comment that kind of struck me last night was Archie was asked about kind of when things went bad, and he mentioned the Nebraska game, and my response in my head was thinking, why did it take almost over a month for whatever change needed to be made to happen? We saw flashes of games where they played well and play hard. Michigan State's an example. They had some other games where they were competitive for times, but Purdue last night, I felt like they competed for a full 40 minutes. So, any sign the rest of the way of a guy dogging it, or of a guy not giving his 110% every minute on the court, I would just say, get off the court. Get on the bench. If you're not going to continue to try to win games for this program, then we're not going to play you. And I think that's really how you set the tone for moving forward, because it's not fun, obviously, for everybody, but it looks a whole lot worse when you're losing games like you did at Minnesota than last night. And so I think people can be understanding, and they're never going to accept losing, but they can see a game like last night and say, wow, they fought, they battled, they played hard if they would have only done this the whole season. But they can't tolerate something like we saw at Minnesota happening again. And I think as a coaching staff, if that means putting in VJ Blackman and Johnny Jager and losing by 35, then I think you do that, because you just cannot tolerate guys not playing the game the right way, and have any credibility with your fan base or with the rest of the locker room, because it's not fair to the other guys in the court. If you've got one guy out there dogging it or doing stuff consistently, not kind of within the team concept, then you're undermining not only the guys on the bench, but also the guys that they have to play with. And I just think that's just something that can't happen.
Yeah, I agree. I think the rest of the season is important, win or lose. What's going to be tolerated around here? What's the standard going to be? What kind of culture are we building? And I think for the kind of program Archie wants to build, which is based on defense, based on toughness, culture is going to be such an important part of that. And so,
Well, do you remember I think it wasn't 2 or 3 years ago that Purdue had kind of a up and down season, and Painter sent 2 or 3 guys packing after the year, because it's like these dudes might be more talented than what we normally got, but they're not doing it the way that he wanted to do it. And he's succeeded with lesser caliber players. Now, the question becomes with Purdue is, I think you can do that and succeed during the regular season. I wonder whether they have the kind of players who can actually make a run in the NCAA tournament. I don't think they do, but I give Painter credit. You look at the talent that he had compared to the guys that Indiana has. I mean, he's got Edwards and nobody else there that you'd say, would you take those guys over some of the guys that Indiana has? You probably wouldn't, but he finds a way to get those guys to buy into his culture and do the things that he wants them to do, and they're successful. And you have to admire that and tip your cap to it.
Toughness, togetherness, effort, they go a long way on a basketball
and
court.
Being smart with the basketball and being committed to playing defense and rebounding and not giving up when you fall behind. He's got a walk-on out there in Eifert. He's got a project in Harms. He's got Nogel Eastern, who's a terrible offensive player, but, dogged the heck out of Romeo, and, Ryan Klein, who Indiana really didn't want because they thought he was slow. He's he's thrown in a couple threes. He makes it work.
They got Sasha Stefanovic coming in, hitting the three-pointer, and Indiana recruited his teammate, Grant Gilon. And I remember hearing everybody talk about, well, they didn't even get the best guy off the Crown Point team, and it sounds like that's actually true because Purdue's made him and they redshirted him last year. And another guy Travion Williams, came on campus this summer and I think lost 60 pounds, and all of a sudden they unwrap him it's like they unwrap him out of a box in late December and all right, here's the guy who can come get a double-double. So people don't want to hear people don't want to give Purdue credit, and I agree with the comments of, what's Purdue's, I think this is Painter's 14th season. I think he's won 2 Big Ten titles. He's never been past the Sweet 16, but his teams do consistently play hard the same way, and he doesn't put up with any of the nonsense. You mentioned him getting rid of some guys. I think that was the kind of the period where they had Ronnie Johnson, some other guys. That was the year where Indiana was really good and just kind of blew them off the court 4 straight. And Painter was like, this isn't going to happen anymore. And pretty much since then, they've owned the rivalry.
Yeah, no, they've built a culture. They've gotten old, stayed old, and been able to pass that down. And that's what Archie's going to have to do at Indiana to succeed long term. Last topic, real quick, and this kind of became a big thing today. But obviously, there were some chants at Simon Scott Assembly Hall last night. FU Harms. We heard all about that. It was, it was made into a big deal. He apparently, took it kind of personally. I thought the best response of all was when Matt Painter was asked about it in the post-game press conference, and he basically shrugged and said that's part of it. Kind of laughed it off a little bit. But it's become a big thing today. Some former IU players were talking about it. Fred Glass issued a statement, kind of asking the students to knock it off. Rick, we all remember at certain times, back in the day when Bob Knight would get on the PA system and, tell the crowd, to stop doing this, stop doing that. Did you have a problem with the chant last night by the students? And what do you think the proper response, if any, by IU should have been?
I didn't hear it. I wasn't at the game. I was on TV and it didn't come across. I didn't. I couldn't tell that's what they were saying. But to be honest with you, I had the game on mute, so I wouldn't have heard it now that I think about it. I was there during the Bob Knight days when he first started, and I would respect Archie and or Fred Glass both more if one of them would go and grab the microphone and point at the students emphatically and say, "Knock it off. That's not what's done here." And I think that that and the BS chant and all that stuff, I don't like it, and I think you're better to stand for somebody, cheer for your team. You can boo the other team, but don't inject profanity into it. Beyond the fact that it's a bad look and it's a classless look, I think you also have to remember there's like younger kids there at the game, and it's unnecessary. I think it's a bad look.
How do you balance then wanting to have a tough, hostile environment, where you do get on other teams and make them? And look, I generally agree with you that I don't personally like it myself. I wish they wouldn't do it. I don't necessarily know that I think it's something that that shouldn't be done, because it is done a lot of different places. How do you then balance wanting to have that tough, hostile environment? If you're,
I think you can create noise and you can shake balloons or newspapers or yell, boo or whistle, or like they do in Europe at soccer matches and stuff like that. You can come up with some kind of gimmick. I just think profanity is like the easiest, thing to do to try and act tough or to try and act hostile. And I just think it's unnecessary. And I know that I'm old school in that way, but I liked it better when Knight did rule the room and say, this is Indiana. Fans don't act that way. And I've seen it happen at other schools where I've seen coaches grab the microphone. I saw Kevin Keats do it at NC State. And I think it's issuing a statement. To me, it's either you really do mean it and you step up and enforce it, or you don't say anything. Issuing a statement's not going to really do anything to dissuade anybody.
That I agree with wholeheartedly. There's something about, the coach grabbing the microphone and kind of saying like, look, this is, I run things around here, and like whether you agree or disagree, it's almost like an ownership thing where it's like, I like it when coaches do that. Alex, what do you think about that story and kind of how it's taken off today?
I just don't understand why it's even being brought up at this point, because
Dockich brought it up, didn't he?
I think there was a column in the Star about it. But my whole thing is, it's like, why is it a topic right now after this game? I mean, it's. I remember like one of Crean's first years, they chanted something at one of the Maryland players, and he got in the press conference and like ripped into the students. But I mean, I've been to, I don't know how many, I've been pretty much every home game the last 7 or 8 years, and there's been all kinds of profane chants. And so all of a sudden, this is because somebody writes about it or talks about it, there has to be a statement issued. Like, either have a clear policy on what you expect and enforce it, or just don't talk about it anymore. Like, I agree. Like, what does sending an email do? I mean, is it, what are they going to do? Are they going to, there was no consequence. Like, it's please knock it off. Okay. Well, what does that mean? Are they going to come into the student section and start a pillow fight with the guys if they don't stop? I mean, what's I don't understand what the point of it is.
Yeah, it's a weak response.
It's a whole PR thing, right? Because I mean, first of all, you have this news that that Fred Glass called up to Purdue to issue an apology. Well, have you ever been to a Purdue home game? Even when they're not playing IU, the student section chants IU sucks the whole game. I mean, is the Purdue AD obviously thinks that's okay? So it's to me, it's just like it's all a PR thing, right? Because somebody wrote something about it in the state's largest newspaper and people are talking about it. You feel like you have to respond. Either have a clear policy on what you're going to allow and enforce it. If you have to stop the game once and say, we're not going to keep playing until you guys stop doing this, then you have to do that. But otherwise, it's just, I mean, I just think it's a PR blunder. That's my opinion.
The theme of this episode, in the words of the great Mike Ehrmantraut from Breaking Bad, no more half measures. No more half measures. Go all the way. Whether it's playing time for guys who aren't playing hard, don't give them 15 minutes. Sit them the whole game. If it's something like this, either stand up and do something in the moment or don't do anything at all. I agree with that sentiment.
Well said, Jerod.
Okay. Well, have we hit everything? Are there any other lingering topics that we need to talk about? I mean, we squeezed 45 minutes out of talking about a team that's lost 12 out of 13, and I think got some meaningful things accomplished. So I feel good about what we've done here today.
Yes, sir.
Yep. It's going to be an interesting, if nothing else, conclusion to the season, because if they if there's a relapse to previous games Friday and Tuesday and Saturday, this could get pretty ugly.
In the words of Hawk Harrelson, you can cancel the postgame show. I don't want to do another one.
Is that when the
Iowa game? Yeah, Iowa game's Friday night.
And they just lost a home game to Maryland, so
yeah, we'll see. We will see. Hopefully, the Hoosiers have something positive for us in store down the stretch. Let's hope that they can take the momentum, at least the effort from last night, and build on it. That would be an important step. All right, Rick, thank you so much for your time. Always appreciate you coming on
you guys.
Lending your insight.
All right, anytime.
All right, and we will talk to you all next week on another brand new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Hopefully we have a win or two to discuss when we're on here. We'll talk to you then. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.